Yesterday we read the story of the destruction of Sedom. Sedom Amira Admo Tzvoim. Now, in many places throughout Tanakh and the writings of Chazal, seems to be taken for granted that the destruction of Sedom and Amira leaves an everlasting impact. For one example, in Parashas Nitzavim, where it talks about destruction that will befall the people if they misbehave and follow Avodah Zarah. So it says, "V'amar ador ha'achar," in that later generation will say, "Hey, what is all this destruction that is like the destruction of Sedom and Amira, which was full of gofris v'melach, sulfur and salt," which is interesting because we're going to touch upon this soon, but in the actual story of Sedom, salt isn't explicitly mentioned except with V'tehi netziv melach, that Lot's wife became a pillar of salt. But in the destruction of Sedom itself, melach is not mentioned over there in yesterday's Parsha of Vayera, but it is mentioned in Nitzavim. I'm not going to give more examples, but throughout the words of the prophets, the destruction of Sedom is referenced many times, and it's something that is always remembered. So what I want to do today is go through a number of items which Sfarim talk about as being remnants from the destruction of Sedom. So I'm going to start off with Vatabit Ishle Me'acharav V'tehi netziv melach. Lot's wife looked back, Me'acharav, Rashi says Me'acharav means behind Lot, V'tehi netziv melach, and she became a pillar of salt. Now, the Gemara in Brachas, in the last chapter of Brachas, enumerates different brachas that you say upon observing certain things. So you see the rainbow we spoke about recently, you make a bracha zoichar abris, etc. You see a place where a miracle happened, you make a bracha for the miracle. And then the Gemara says that when a person sees the wife of Lot, he says the bracha, he says the bracha dayin ha'emes. And the Gemara says, how could you say dayan ha'emes? Surely all the other things in that section of the Gemara are miracles. You saw whether the place where the Jews crossed over the Yarden, etc. There's brachas for miracles, and you make a bracha praising Hashem. Dayan ha'emes is not actually praising Hashem. So the Gemara refines it to be saying actually that there's two brachas. One bracha for the wife of Lot and one bracha for Lot, but as the Mefarshim explain, that both of those brachas are recited when you see the wife of Lot. So if a person sees the wife of Lot in a pillar of salt, so he makes two brachas. One bracha is dayan ha'emes, because this is a sad sight to behold, but then there's also a positive bracha, because when you see Lot's wife, you also remember about her husband Lot, and you remember that Lot was saved from Sedom in the merit of Avraham. Lot was saved from Sedom, and therefore you make another bracha, Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech ha'olam zoicher es hatzadikim, who remembers the righteous. And I saw in the Sefer, I think I saw this in the Be'er Mayim Chaim, which is a Chassidish Sefer, where he says that the proximity of the fact that Lot's wife turned around and she became a pillar of salt, that means she was so close to the destruction, and Lot, who's right in front of her, he is spared. So that sort of emphasizes the Zoicher et Tzadikim, the kindness to Avram, that even though Lot was literally right next to the danger, nevertheless he was still spared. I want to point out the words of the Gemara, which we're going to get back to later. The Gemara says, Brishlei Mekulhu Nisa, all the other things that we enumerated here are miracles. Allah Ishti Shalit Pura Nusahi, but the wife of Lot is a sad thing, so what does it mean that you praise Hashem? And then the Gemara goes on to say, no, there's two brachas, there's dayan ha'emes, but then there's the other bracha, Zoicher et Tzadikim, which is praising Hashem. This Gemara is brought halacha lemaisa in Shulchan Aruch, Eira Chaim, Siman Reish Yud Ches, where the Mechaber says, I believe it's in Sif Ches, Haroya Ishtei Shalot, somebody who sees Lot's wife, Mevarich Shtayim makes two brachas. Aleha, on her, Omer, Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech ha'olam dayan ha'emes, v'alot, and on Lot, Omer, Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech ha'olam zoicher hatzadikim. In our Gemara it says zoicher es hatzadikim, in Shulchan Aruch it says zoicher hatzadikim. Be that as it may. Okay, so I think it's fair to assume that this Gemara is taking for granted that Lot's wife as a pillar of salt is something that is currently extant and visible, and something that is an observable phenomena for people to go and see and make a bracha on. Now, this idea that Lot's wife as a pillar of salt remains for a long time is something that's found in a number of sources, and I will enumerate a number of them. First of all, in Targum Yerushalmi, that's one of the Targumim on one of the Aramaic Midrashic commentaries on the Torah, and the pasuk he writes, "V'ha hi kayama amud demelach adzman deyechun meisaya." The pillar of salt is extant standing until the time of the resurrection of the dead. Okay, Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer is a midrashic work which is usually attributed to Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus. And over there, at the end of chapter 25, it says the whole story of Lot, and then it says, "V'nasis netziv melach," she became a pillar of salt. V'adayin hu oimed, that pillar of salt is still standing. Kol hayoyim loichachim oisa hashavarim, every day or all day, the oxen lick the salt. And they lick down all the salt until her toes. And in the morning, it regrows, it regenerates. And I believe that this medrash about her being the pillar of salt being eaten up by the animals every day, and then regenerating is a medrash which we grow, like it rings a bell, is something I would have heard as a young child in Cheder. Similar versions of the same medrash are also recorded by the Rekeach in his commentary, where he talks about not oxen, but he talks about goats licking the salt every day, and also in the historical Sefer Seder HaDoros, I've mentioned in the past that Seder HaDoros also quotes. He just quotes. He's collecting from all different works, and he does certainly quotes from works that are not considered reliable. But in this particular case, he quotes a book by the name of Galilois Eretz Yisrael from Reb Gershon ben Eliezer Halevi. I don't know, I didn't have a chance to look up exactly who or what this is, but he writes over there that he saw the goats. He says after midnight the pillar of salt was complete, 2 hours, but the goats were licking it, and 2 hours before sunrise there was only just a small amount, 2 tefachim left, because there were hundreds of goats coming from the nearby villages and licking up the salt. Okay? Similar midrashim are quoted by Torah Shlema. Torah Shlema is a contemporary work by Mendel Kasher, where he quotes all sorts of midrashim and puts them all together, and he quotes similar sources. And there is in the sources that he quotes, and I also found this even more explicitly in Radal. Radal is a 1800s, 19th century commentary on the Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer, which we just mentioned, and he brings a medrash that says, "Hinachti zikar nolam," that Hashem says, "I am leaving an everlasting remembrance to this destruction of Sedom." Similarly, in Sefer HaYashar, which is also a historical book, we actually mentioned that last Shabbos, of questionable authorship, and it's unclear exactly who the author is and what the exact nature of the reliability, if you will, of the book. But anyway, this is a theme that is found in numerous sources of Midrashim. The Rameh Mifano, Reb Menachem Azari Mifano. Fano is a city in Italy. And Menachem Azari Mifano, his dates are 1548 to 1620. He's a very important and prominent both Rav and Pesach, halachic authority, and also a Kabbalist, quoted all over the place, both in Kabbalistic works and Chassidic works and in halachic works. He's a very prominent figure. And he has a Kabbalistic work by the name of Gilgulei Neshomis, where he talks about Gilgulim, reincarnation. And he writes like this: Iris Ishte Shalot, the wife of Lot, whose name was Iris. There's different, actually, versions of different midrashim if her name was Iris or Idis. Be that as it may, Iris, the wife of Lot, Ein Lo Gilgul, she has no reincarnation. Dichsiv, because the pasuk says Ad Hayoim Hazeh, until this very day. Now I want to interject over here. He seems to be saying that as if there's a pasuk that says that she is a pillar of salt until this very day. There is no such pasuk, so it's somewhat of a phantom quote. In the Sefer HaYashar, which I mentioned earlier, it does say those words, Ad Hayoim Hazeh. Be that as it may, the Rameh Mifano is clearly influenced by all these midrashim, which talk about this pillar of salt being a phenomenon that lasts for years. So, that's how this quote comes to be, so to speak. And then he says, why does she have no Gilgal? I have a Mishnah, Gamkin, he quotes the Mishnah, the Gemara that says, it's not a Mishnah, it's a bracha, I think, that if you see the wife of Lot, you make a bracha. So again, the implication being that Lot's wife is still there. Ki nishmasa hi doimemes. Her neshama is doimem. Doimem means still or inanimate. All the salt that the animals lick off of her, they just regurgitate. It just goes back and it regenerates. So it's just her again. There's no Gilgal happening. Now, there's some, what's the point of Gilgal? What's the point of reincarnation? We're not going into the whole Gilgal topic right now, but Gilgal is there to give the neshama a tikkun. In other words, there's something in the person's lifetime that was not managed to be accomplished. That's, you have another chance, so to speak, to accomplish it. So how does Lot's wife get her rectification if she can't have a Gilgal? So he continues, V'tikuna hu al kol korbancha takriv melach, that the Gemara says that on all your karbonis you bring salt. Okay, so I'm sorry, not the Gemara. That's a pasuk. The pasuk says that you have to bring salt on the mizbeach. With all karbonis, you salt them. And then he continues. Also on your table, a person's table on which you eat is like a mizbeach, and therefore that's why we have salt on our table. Hatzad mechal lechem. Some acronym here, some Kabbalistic thing. I didn't have a chance to look up exactly what he means there. Machal means to atone for. Lechem is bread. So you dip your bread in the salt. Okay. Now, all he says is that Lot's wife's tikkun comes from bringing salt in the mizbeach. Now, the Gemara says in Menachos, the Rambam doesn't quote this Gemara. I just want to make this clear. The Gemara says in Menachos that in Chaf Aleph Amud Aleph, that the Torah says you should never not bring salt on the mizbech, but that word loisashbis, the Gemara expounds to mean that you have to bring a type of salt she'eno shiveses, which means that it's always available in all seasons of the year. Melach Sodomis, sodomite salt, is always available, and that's the salt in the mizbech. Now, the Gemara just says sodomite salt. The Gemara doesn't explicitly associate the sodomite salt with the salt with Lot's wife being a pillar of salt. But I think that the Ramam Mifano is already making that connection, that the pillar of salt and the salt in the mizbech is the same thing, and that's why the salt in the mizbech is the tikkun of Lot's wife. So this connection between the salt and the Melach Sodomis, the salt in the mizbech, and Lot's wife is something which I'm going to get back to later on in the class. Let's continue. Josephus in Kadmonius HaYehudim, which they call that in English Antiquities, in chapter 11, he writes, Ve'eshes Lot hebita ma'achreo lam rispi Hashem. Lot's wife turned back, rebelling the word of Hashem, but he netziv malach she became a pillar of salt. Says Josephus, Ve'onoichi ro'isi oid be'enayes netziv ha'melach hahu hanitzov sham ad hayoim hazeh. Obviously, this is a Hebrew translation of Josephus. I saw that with my very own eyes that pillar of salt, which is still there until this very day. Now, another secular source, Josephus, I don't know exactly how you define secular or not, but here's definitely a secular source from an individual by the name of William Francis Lynch, whose dates are April 1st, 1801 to October 17th, 1865. And according to Wikipedia, he was an officer in the American Navy and explorer of the land of Israel. He was the first to draw an accurate and detailed map of the Jordan River and the Dead Sea. Now, he has a book called Narrative of the United States Expedition to the River of Jordan and the Dead Sea, which was published in 1856. And I managed to find a copy of that book on Google Books, and on page 308, in the edition that's on Google Books, he writes that Clement of Rome, a contemporary of Josephus, also mentions this pillar, and likewise Irenaeus, a writer of the 2nd century. So this wasn't just Josephus. There were many contemporaries of Josephus, or a number of contemporaries of Josephus, who mention observing this pillar of salt. They don't mention seeing the animal. There was the Seder Hadoros brings somebody who said he observed the animals licking it. The Josephus doesn't say that, but there's this pillar of salt which they're clearly identifying as being the wife of Lot. Now, there's also, by the way, just very briefly, there's a mountain called the Mount Sedom. The Torah Shlomo writes that the Arabs call it Jabal Austum. Jabal means mountain in Arabic, so the mountain of Sedom, and you could look at Wikipedia on Mount Sedom. There's some stuff about that as well. Now, contrast to all of that, there are many sources that suggest, or a number of sources that suggest that we no longer can observe this. To my knowledge, the first explicit source that I found that says that we cannot see, that we don't know about this, is from Rebbe Vadia of Bartanura, who, by the way, is pretty much a contemporary, slightly earlier than the Rameh Mifano. So Rebbe Vadia of Bartanura, also Italian, and his dates are 1445 to 1515, and he visited Eretz Yisrael. Famously, there's lots of he wrote letters from Eretz Yisrael about his visit. And in his letters, where I saw this is there's a book from Professor Avraham Yari. So in that book on page 135, he reproduces this letter. I'm sure it's published in numerous other places as well. So he says when he was in Yerushalayim, he talks about being in Har HaZeisim, he was able to see the Yam HaMelech from the distance, the Dead Sea. And he asked the people in Yerushalayim, what about maybe we go there to see the wife of Lot? And they said, that region has many different pillars of salt, and there's no specific unique pillar of salt to see and to be identified as Lot's wife. The region is obviously a very salty region, and there's lots of pillars there. There's nothing unique to see over there. So already in the time of Rebbe Vadia of Bartanura, the locals were saying, we don't have anything to show you. Now, I mentioned before the commentary of Radal, of David Luria on Pirkei Belezer. So he also notes the fact that despite all the midrashim he quoted, we do not in fact observe the wife of Lot anymore. And he says that he's seen from history books that there were earthquakes that impacted that area, and so maybe that's why there's no longer, maybe the earthquakes impacted the area in such a way that the wife of Lot either is not there anymore or can no longer be identified anymore. And then he finishes off with an interesting note, and he says that perhaps this is the reason why the Rambam omits this bracha, right? Which that's a question which could be an interesting question in its own right. The Gemara says a halacha, you have to make a bracha when you see the wife of Lot. Why does the Rambam not record that Gemara? It's a halachic Gemara, the Rambam should record it. So, the fact is that the Rambam doesn't mention it, and Rabbi David Luria is suggesting that perhaps the reason he doesn't mention it is because already by the time of the Rambam, and the Rambam lived not far from that region, the Rambam lived in Egypt, so he would know what's going on over there. It was no longer observable, so maybe the Rambam didn't see it necessary to quote that Gemara. Now, in practice, in recent generations, together with lots of other things, there's been a resurgence of interest in this. And there are certain pillars of rock, of salty rock in that area that different people, and if you go on tour guides in the area, there will be tour guides who will tell you that this is the wife of Lot. However, there's nothing really demonstrable to be that over there, and I'll just show you from an article that I found where I think this was on Kikar Shabbos, where he writes that in the Ma'ariv newspaper on the 16th of July in 1990, there was a journalist by the name of Shefi Gabai who reported about a Jordanian archaeologist who claims to have found the wife of Lot somewhere on the east bank of the Jordan River. Not more than a year later, on the 28th of November 1991, in the Israeli newspaper Chadashot, there was an article reporting of the wife of Lot being discovered on the western, on our side of the Jordan River. Now, there was a Chabad scholar by the name of Rabbi Yeshua Munshain, very interesting man, tremendous scholar, published numerous stuff, and he did. This is like nostalgic for me. This is in my heyday in yeshiva. This was going on for a couple of years, I think. He was publishing every week or every other week, whatever it was, a series called Sipurim V'Gilguleihem, and showing how stories develop and grow, and So in one of his articles, he showed how you have, the same picture being attributed to being two different people, and he goes on many of that genre of things. And you can see here from the distance, he shows you two pictures, and he says, here's the wife of Lot on the west of the Jordan, here's the wife of Lot on the east of the Jordan. So take your pick. Now, in practice, There are some obscure poskim who will say all sorts of things, but the accepted practice today is that we do not know anything about the identity of the pillar of salt that is Lot's wife. And when you see any of these pillars, you do not say the bracha that the Gemara mentions to say, and that's the end of that. However, I should mention that all of this is taking for granted that V'tihi Netziv Melach means that Lot's wife became a pillar of salt. However, there is another way to understand those psukim, which can be found in numerous mefarshim. So, first of all, Rabbeinu Bechaya quotes the Ibn Ezra, who says that V'tihi Netziv Melach doesn't mean that she became a pillar of salt, she referring to Lot's wife, but rather that V'tihi Netziv Melach means that the city of Sedom, became a pillar of salt. In other words, the destruction had fire and gofris and sulfur, and as the pasuk says in the Tzavim, it also had salt. So the city became a mound of salt. Right? Now, the reason I quote that from Rabbeinu Bechaya in the name of the Ibn Ezra is because in our editions of the Ibn Ezra, this comment is not found. But Rabbeinu Bechaya clearly had some edition of a manuscript of the Ibn Ezra that had that comment in. Now, next we go on to Ralbag, and this is really fascinating. Ralbag writes like this. V'tihi Netziv Melach, she became a pillar of salt. Now you have to know in English we have the non-gendered it, right? But in Hebrew everything is either he or she, right? So a city is she. So the land of Sedom and Amorah, Melach became like a big pillar of salt. Listen to this. Because of the strength of the burning of the fire that created the salt. And he quotes the pasuk in the Tzavim, and then he says, you should know, ki meha'aretz hanisrefes, from burning earth, from burning land, yischadesh hamelach, that generates salt, k'moishe hisboir b'sefer ha'osos, as is explained in the Book of Wonders. I'll get back to that in a moment. Now, the problem over here is, if you say V'tihi Netziv Melach means that the city became a pillar of salt, but what are the words in the pasuk immediately before that? It says, V'tabit ishli me'achrav, his wife looked back, V'tihi Netziv Melach, and the city of Lot became a pillar of salt. So why are you mentioning that his wife looked back? So that question is something that I saw the Toldos Yitzchak. Toldos Yitzchak is Rabbi Yitzchak Karo. That's an uncle of the author of the Shulchan Aruch, uncle of Rabbi Yosef Karo. He asks this question. He says, "What do you mean? The Torah is clearly making a connection. She looked back. Why are we mentioning her looking back?" Number two, it's clear from the story that Lot's wife died, because later on Lot comes to the mountain with his two daughters, and he impregnates his daughters. His wife is not there, right? So clearly his wife died. Says the Rabbi, the Torah doesn't need to mention that his wife died, because it's obvious from the context, and the Malach had already warned them that if they look back they would die, so it doesn't need to mention it. Now, I want to get back to this Ralbag and the Sefer HaOsos. However, before I do that, I want to point out that the Ralbag himself is very much a rationalist, and I'm going to talk about that in a moment. Ibn Ezra also quite rationalist. I found the same pirush brought in the Cheskuni. The Cheskuni writes that the city became, the land became Netziv Melach. Now, why that's interesting to me is like this. Cheskuni is not in any way known to be a rationalist. Cheskuni is just copying from all sorts of mefarshim that he had access to and that he heard. So he's telling you that there's another commentary in this pasuk, that the Chazal's commentary and the halachic commentary is that she became a pillar of salt, but there's another alternative commentary, and that's fine. Like we have that all over the place, that Pshutei Shel Mikra could have a commentary that doesn't match with halacha. That's totally fine. Now it's interesting to note that Cheskuni is north, he's in France, right? Ralbag is in Provence. In general, you get the impression that Provence was much more rationalist, together with Spain also, which is the Ibn Ezra. So we have Ibn Ezra and Ralbag, but certainly, Meiri is from Provence. You get the feeling that Provence is much more rationalist, much more so than Ashkenaz, which is Germany and northern France. And by the way, it's interesting to note that the Rambam's writings, I'm not even talking about his philosophical writings, even the Rambam's halachic writings, his Mishnah Torah, were quoted and had a much stronger impact in Provence. The French and the German, the Ashkenaz, the northern Ashkenaz Rishonim pretty much never quote the Rambam, right? So I'm just pointing out, it's interesting that seems to be a more sort of hub of rationalism. Now, finally, on a similar vein, you have the Bechor Shor. Now, the Bechor Shor is not Provence; he's France. The Remy Orleans, right? Not New Orleans, just Orleans. And so the thing with him is, I wouldn't call him a rationalist in the sense of trying to avoid miracles and things like that. He is a rationalist in the sense of in Pshutei Shel Mikra, in understanding Chumash, he has a very hyper Pshutei Shel Mikra approach, which is different than Chazal. So many stories, for example, one of his big things is he says when you have two similar stories in the Torah, they're actually the same story. For example, in Beshalach, Moshe hits the rock, and in what's it called? And Hashem tells him to hit the rock, and later on he hits the rock. It's the same story, right? So he also says that not that the city became a pillar of salt. He says like this: Vatihina Tzimmelach, Lot's wife became a pillar of salt. Why did she become a pillar of salt? It's Pashat, because that whole place was exploding in fire and salt and sulfur. So she was sort of drowned in an how do you pronounce that word? Avalanche of salt. She was covered by salt. That's what it means she became a pillar of salt. So perhaps also rationalist in a sense, but more just sticking to the words, and also it's not referring to the city. It's referring to Lot's wife, and he actually finishes off, if I recall correctly. I didn't. I don't have this on my paper here, but if I recall correctly, he says that however, rumors are that there is actually a pillar of salt there that's Lot's wife, so maybe, so he's kind of acknowledges that the Pirush of Chazal as well. Okay. Now, when I read this Ralbag, it says as is explained in the book of Isis. So I wanted to know, what is this book of Isis? And I turned to my friend Rabbi Shraga Homnik, who's an expert at figuring these things out, and actually opened the whole window of stuff. Now, Ralbag's commentary to the Torah is actually split into three sections. He has the Bir HaMilus, which is translating the words, the Bir HaParsha, explaining the story, and the Bir HaToyaliyos, like the moral lessons to learn from this. Now, we're not going to get into a whole deep dive right now of exactly Ralbag's philosophy and theology and etc. etc. But like I said, he was very rationalist and very into much influenced by the sciences and by the writings of Aristotle, and he has a whole shitta, a whole approach to understanding miracles in the Torah. And he basically he's talking about miracles, not about natural phenomena. Talking about miracles, and he's saying that the Hashem creates miracles all using sort of orchestrating or manipulating science. So basically, all the miracles are explained by what did Hashem do to the science in order to create this miracle. That's A. B. He has a principle that Hashem never does a miracle, will never do a miracle without a specific purpose. So, for example, here he says, what in the world would be the point of Lot's wife becoming a pillar of salt? Like, so you could say, okay, so it's going to, people will see that, and that will be influenced in fear of, in awe of God. But nobody's there to see it. There is the Sedom's destroyed, Lot's running away. Nobody's there to see it. So, for example, the Abarbanel, when he quotes this Ralbag, he says, "Nishtabish Ralbag." The Ralbag is wrong. He explains that Vatihina Tzimmelach doesn't refer to his wife, Kim al Sedom, but to Sedom. And then he writes, what brought Ralbag to this opinion was, why would Hashem do such a miracle? This is, the Ralbag is wrong and it's mistaken, and he goes on to explain why he thinks Ralbag is wrong in this regard. But this is Ralbag's approach. Number one, miracles happen through Hashem manipulating what they call meteorology, and some things which you might think are miracles are actually not miracles; they're just natural phenomena. So, for example, in the writings of Ralbag, which in the English they call him Gersonides, because Rabbi Levi ben Gershon, so Gersonides. So there's an article here written by a Sarah Klein Breslavi, published in 2010. Called Gersonides' use of Aristotle's meteorology in his account of some biblical miracles. So she So first of all, she explains a host of miracles in the Torah, which the Rabbi admits they're miracles, but he explains them through explaining how Hashem manipulated the signs. So the whole destruction of Sedom and Amorah has some sort of miraculous and natural explanation of how the miracle happened. By the way, probably not too different from Pompeii, which we know is it's a story that happened about 2,000 years, around 2,000 years ago. Right, the Babel, the pillar of fire and pillar of cloud that accompany the Jewish people, etc., etc. Many miracles in the Torah he describes in this way. That's A. B, there are certain things that he explains that they're not even miracles, and one of them is the wife of Lot. It's not a miracle, B'chlal. And I'm going to read to you a few sections from this Sarah Klein Breslavi's article. She writes like this. After recounting the destruction of Sedom and Gomorrah, the Bible mentions the fate of Lot's wife who fled Sedom with her family. Lot's wife looked behind him and she became a pillar of salt. For Gersonides, the verse describes a natural event, not a miracle. Here too his interpretation is based on meteorology. The almost universal reading of this view, reflected in all standard translations, is that when Lot and his family fled from Sedom, his wife looked back at the city and she was turned into a pillar of salt. But the Rabbi rejects that, and he relies on the criterion of purpose in order to determine whether a biblical incident was a miracle. The transformation of a woman into a pillar of salt is undoubtedly outside the normal course of nature, but such a reading does not justify the condition that a miracle must always have a purpose. So here the purpose would be that the people may fear the Lord. That would entail witnesses to the miracle who would be moved by it to fear the Lord. But only the only refugees of Sedom were Lot and his family, and his wife was lagging behind her husband and his daughters. Consequently, nobody could benefit from her instant salinization. Okay, and so he goes on to explain. So therefore, Al-Bag says, this is something that is a natural phenomena based on the Sefer HaIsis. So our author here, Sarah Klein, tells you exactly what the Sefer HaIsis is. It's a certain book by Aristotle with a commentary translated by an Ibn something or other, which was then further translated into Hebrew by Ibn Tibbon, that was Ralbag access, was through the Hebrew translation. And that's why he refers to it as Sefer HaIsis. And basically, in this book of meteorology called Sefer HaIsis, there is this theory of burning earth creating salt, and that's what Ralbag is relying on to explain the natural phenomena of the earth, as is explained in Sefer HaIsis, that burning earth creates salt. So to wrap up our discussion of Lot's wife, before we move on to the other sections, we have these rationalist, if you will, explanations that talk about the city of Lot becoming a pillar of salt, or you have the B'chai Shor. But the normative approach, which is reflected in Chazal and in the Gemara and in Halacha, is that Lot's wife became a pillar of salt, and at least in theory, there's even a bracha to be said on observing that phenomenon. Now, the Rebbe touched an interesting. There's another Gemara about the wife of Lot, which we're not getting into now. But at the end of Niddah, there's a Gemara which talks about whether or not somebody would become tamei, ritually impure, by touching the wife of Lot. So the Rebbe has a discussion of that Gemara, which was later published in Likutei Sichos in Chelik Yud Ches, volume 18 on Parshas Chukas. And it's also in the Rebbe's own notes. We have some of the Rebbe's own notes published on this in the Rishimus and number Kuf Chavtes. And over that, sort of the Rebbe emphasizes that Lot's wife turning into a pillar of salt was a miracle. And the Rebbe says, even though the Gemara mentioned it before, even though the Gemara says all the other things are a miracle, but Lot's wife is Puranos, it doesn't mean to say it's not miraculous. It was miraculous, but it's not a miracle to celebrate. It's a sad thing. So the Rebbe sort of emphasizing that's a miracle. Why is the Rebbe emphasizing it? So I think the Rebbe sort of the Rebbe's are aware of all these other interpretations, and the Rebbe's sort of emphasizing that the traditional Chazal approach is that this was a miraculous phenomena, that she became into a pillar of salt. Now, before we move on to other things, I just want to tie up with some thoughts, not necessarily 100% fully developed and room for more discussion. But I mentioned before that the Rameh Pano connects the Melech Sedomis on the Mizbeach to the wife of Lot. Now, in the Gemara, we have two things that we talk about Melech Sedomis. Number one is that it's brought on the Mizbeach. Number two, Melech Sedomis could cause a person to become blind, which is the basis, or in one Gemara, the Gemara in Chulin, that's the basis for the mitzvah of Mayim Achronim. Before benching, you have to wash your hands. So why do you have to wash your hands? Because you might have melech sodomis on your hands from eating, though you don't have cutlery, and if you touch your eyes, it could make you blind. Okay? Now, again, the Gemara doesn't explicitly make this connection, but if we're going to assume there's a connection between the salt of the destruction of Sodom and the salt that is Lot's wife, and this salt that we're calling Sodomite salt that could blind you, then it all ties together very nicely. Because, of course, the people of Sodom themselves, they become blind, Hikubas and Verim. And what is the salt all about? The salt is about, like Rashi says, she chata b'melach, she didn't want to host the guest, she didn't want to even give salt to the guest. And so she's punished by becoming a pillar of salt. And so, and so there's this. The salt represents the being self-indulgent, the being only focused on yourself, and not being able to grow or to give kindness to anybody else, right? And perhaps that's also this strange imagery that the Medrash talks about, the animals coming and licking up the salt every day, and it all goes down to the ground and it regenerates, and perhaps that's describing this sort of vicious cycle that is indulging in your own taivas, in your own desires, and not being able to see the world outside of you, not able to be focused on growth, not able to be kind to other people, that's what it becomes of it. It just becomes this never-ending vicious cycle of trying to fulfill yourself, but not actually having any fulfillment, and then just, you regenerate, and it's just this vicious cycle. So that's just an idea. I also want to mention one more source, which is relevant over here, is two more sources actually. One is the Gemara in Shabbos. The Gemara in Shabbos says that the water of the Yam HaMelech is good for your eyes. So the Meiri, also Provence, the Meiri asks, how could the water of Yam HaMelech be good for your eyes? The salt of Yam HaMelech is sodomite salt, and that's bad for your eyes, right? So again, whatever the Meiri answers, he says, well, maybe the salt is bad and the water is good, as is the case with many medicinal things, that part of it is bad and part of it is good. But you see again that the Meiri seems to connect the Sedom salt that we're talking about, that's bad for the eyes, and the salt from that region. I should also mention that in the book My Prayer, published by Kahas, on the topic of Mayim Achronim, there's a very nice article about Mayim Achronim, which also makes this connection, by Nissen Mendel, on the Malach Sodom and the wife of Lot, and the people of Sodom. I should also mention that many people don't wash Mayim Achronim. And Tosfos, the basis for not washing Mayim Achronim is in the Tosfos in the Gemara and Chulin over there that says that nowadays we don't have any of this sodomite salt that is blind for you. So if we're going to make the connection, well, perhaps the fact that we no longer have the Netziv Malach, that is Lot's wife, is part of the reason why we no longer have the dangerous salt that blinds you, be that as it may. All right, we're going to move on to the next thing. First, I'm going to talk very briefly about Kiter Haaretz. So, in the description of the destruction of Sodom, the pasuk says, "V'hinei ala Kiter Haaretz k'Kiter HaKivshon," that Avraham Avinu observed the smoke of the destruction of Sodom. There's a pasuk in Yeshaya in chapter 34 where it talks about the retribution that will be when Hashem punishes the enemies of the Jewish people. Payment for those who fight Zion. The rivers, streams will be turned into Zephas, into tar. Its earth will be turned into sulfur. Will be burning. The smoke will never be extinguished. Says the Radak, this is exactly like Sodom. That till today, the smoke from Sodom can be observed. Okay, so that's what the Radak mentions in his commentary to Yeshaya. Now, I want to move on to the next thing, so we're not going to focus too much on this, but I'll just mention that there are, just like before we mentioned historical works, scientific works that mention observing the pillar of salt that is Lot's wife, there are also scientific works that mention observing smoke coming out of, some sort of subterranean volcanic explosions in that region, or things like that, about which they understood to be remnants from the destruction of Sodom. And now I'm going to move on to Tzemach HaAdama. Okay, so we spoke before about salt, But the pasuk in the description of Sedom also mentions tzemach ha'adama, that the vegetation was destroyed. And Chazal understand this to mean that not just was the vegetation that existed then destroyed, but that region's capacity is right, just like salt doesn't allow things to grow, that region's capacity to generate, to create growth was killed. So, the Medrash says, Bereshis Rabbah Nun Aleph Dalet, says that Amar Rabbi Shua ben Levi, Ad Achshav, even till today, till the times of Rabbi Shua ben Levi, if a person will collect rain from the area of Sedom, and water his patch of field with it, it's not going to grow. A similar version of the same address is found in other sources, sort of in a number of places. The way I copied it here on my source sheet is from the Chizkuni, where he says, that if you get earth from Sedom and transplant that earth in another region, it's not going to grow. Okay? That's what it says in Chazal. Where this becomes really fascinating is later on. So first of all, there is, I'll give you a few sources for this. First of all, there is a sefer by Rabbi Yaakov Emden called Eim Levina. We knew about the sefer for many years. The Rabbi Yaakov Emden quotes it numerous times in his works. But it was published for the first time 5 years ago in Tafshin Pei, actually by a cousin of mine, Rabbi Tzibel from Yerushalayim, who worked for many years on deciphering the manuscript that's in the British Library, and he published it. And I have the book at home. And there is a pasuk in Hazinu which compares the nations to Geffen Sedom, the fruits of the vines of Sedom. And Rabbi Yaakov Emden over there talks about the idea that the ways of the nation, specifically idolatry, externally is very flashy and attractive, but when you get into it, it's full of falsehood and lies. And he says, how appropriate is it that the Torah compares this idolatry to Geffen Sedom, to Sedom. Why? What's Sedom? Kihine says Rabbi Yaakov, I have seen in history books, or maybe a better word would be science books, that till this very day, Gedelim Sham Peris in the region of Sedom, fruit grow, Nechamodim Lamara that are beautiful to observe, V'toicham Efer, but inside it is just ashes or dust. So the same is true. Avodah Zarah is externally attractive, it looks beautiful like a beautiful tree, fruit, but inside it is bitter. Now, similarly, in Haksav HaKabbalah is Rabbi Yaakov Tzvi Mecklenburg, in his commentary to yesterday's Parsha, Vayero, chapter 19, he writes that he quotes this medrash, that the version of the medrash he has is that the earth of Sedom, even if it's transplanted into another a patch of field, it will not grow. And then he says, those who go on voyages, those who record their journeys and their explorations have recorded for us that in that region nothing can grow. And they said there's another thing. In that region there's an apple that grows, something that looks like an apple, which is beautiful to look at. Inside it's full of smoke and ashes, which cannot be used for anything. And then the Ksav HaKabbalah adds another two words. This is alluded to in the book of the Great Wisdom of Solomon, B'Siman Yud, in chapter Yud. Now, I'm going to get to what that book is in a moment. I just want to interject and say that we've discussed a number of times recently that the English word apple, and the same is true of the Hebrew word tapuach, and the same is true of the Romance word pum, today means apple, right? It has a specific definition. Once upon a time, it just meant a big round fruit. So, for example, we saw Shir Hashirim compares the Jewish people to a tapuach, and according to the Targum, Yonason on the Shir Hashirim, and also according to Tosfos and Shabbos, it doesn't mean an apple; it means an esrog. Similarly, for example, the ananas fruit in English it's called a pine apple, right? Similarly. Actually, in Old English, dates were called finger apples. Also, you have a pomegranate. What does pomegranate mean? So, pom is apple, and granite means full of seeds. Pomegranate, right? Potato, tapuach adama, apple of the earth. In French, also pomme de terre. Terre is earth, terrace, terrain. Yeah. So, pomme de terre. England is Angleterre, England. Terre, yeah. So. Apple just means a big fruit. So, whether describing here this attractive tapuach, it doesn't mean an apple. Obviously, it just means a fruit. Okay. Finally, I'll Okay, I'll just mention that both Heidenheim in his commentary to the Torah also mentions the same thing in the name of the Balei HaMasois, those who record their journeys and their explorations, and he also mentions this book of Chochmas and Rabsa de Shloima, the great wisdom of Solomon. And finally, I'll mention Josephus again, before I mention antiquities, so I'll also mention here Josephus in his book Milchemes HaYehudim, the Wars of the Jews, he writes over there also, observing this fruit, that he himself observed this fruit that is beautiful on the outside. It looks like an edible fruit, but when you open it, it just disappears into smoke and ashes, etc. Now, Sfarim Chitzonim. Okay, what is this book, The Great Wisdom of Solomon? What are we talking about over here, and what exactly is this fruit? Okay, so there is something called Sfarim Chitzonim. In English, it's known as the Apocrypha, the external books. Apocrypha, if I recall correctly, the precise translation of the word Apocrypha is the hidden writings or the external writings. Now, I'm not going to get in. There's numerous books which are part of the Apocrypha. I think probably about 20, 25 books. I don't remember exactly, which are ancient Jewish works that are not part of the canonized Tanakh of the 24 books of Scripture. We're not going to get into the whole sugya now of what the Sfarim Chitzonim are and what the status is, but what I will mention is that not all Apocrypha are created equal. In other words, the Jewish approach to the Apocrypha isn't equal. Some books are more accepted than others. For example, the 4 books of Maccabim are certainly much more accepted than some of the other ones. Now, this specific book of the Apocrypha called Chochma Shloima is one of the more accepted ones, and in fact the Ramban, Nachmanides Ramban, quotes it twice. The Ramban had the Aramaic version of the Chochma Shloima Sefer. He quotes it both in his introduction to the Torah. He talks about the great wisdom of Shloima that wasn't, quote unquote, divinely inspired, and that's why it's not part of the canon, but he seems to be accepting that this is stuff that was attributed to Shlomo HaMelech, which was an oral tradition, and it was transcribed later on during the time of the second Beis HaMikdash, I believe. And also in the beginning of his commentary, of the Ramban's commentary to Koheles, he also quotes this book of Chochma Shloima. Now, there is a pasuk, if you could call it that, a verse in chapter 10 of Chochma Shloima, which reads as follows: Lo eida al pisheihem, as a testimony on their sins. The word Eda is the female version of Eid, testimony. We had it in yesterday's Parsha, Bavurte Alila Eda, right? So as a testimony for the sins of Sedom, 3 things. Number 1, Ha'aretz ha'afucha teshan li'olam, the turned over land will smoke forever. So that's what we mentioned before from the Radak, that you could still observe smoke in that region. They'll never be able to produce the fruit. The trees in that region will never be able to produce ripe fruit. And the pillar of salt is always there as a eternal monument. Okay, so these 3 things that we've discussed: the eternal monument of the pillar of salt, the eternal smoke, and the issue with and the land not being fertile, those are all recorded in this book of the wisdom of Shlomo as the eternal testimony to the destruction of Sedom. Now, there is an individual by the name of Naftali Hertz Wiesel, in English they call him Wesley, who was, I believe, a maskil, or certainly in that kind of school, and he wrote a commentary to this book of the wisdom of Shlomo. And he, for all of these 3 things, he quotes contemporary works of science and history in his day and age, which record these 3 phenomena. So he goes through contemporary works describing observing the smoke periodically coming out of that region. He describes people talking about the fruit, the infertile land, and also about this sodomite apple, which the Ksaba Kabbalah and Rabbi Yaakov Emden mentioned, and also about the pillar of salt being observed. And he quotes Josephus and some of the other sources I mentioned earlier, and he quotes many contemporary sources which can be seen. Now, what exactly is this apple of Sedom that they're all talking about? And this is what we will conclude with. So, basically, there's actually, I wasn't aware of this before I started preparing for this class, but there is a tremendous amount of literature out there online about this sodomite apple of Sedom. The scientific name for the fruit is Calotropis procera. And the calotropis, I'm going to read for you a couple of lines from Wikipedia, and then I will share a video on YouTube about this fruit, and I'll also put the link for that video in the description of the class when I post it to YouTube and podcast, so people who are listening to the class later can consult the video. It's a 10-minute video, but we'll start from approximately minute the 5:45 mark, which is where you could actually get an idea of what this fruit is all about. I should mention also that in the beginning of the second parak of Shabbos, the Mishnah says that you cannot use pasilas hamidbar, the wicks of the desert, to light Shabbos candles with. So some scholars think that the pasilas hamidbar is the fiber that's created from this fruit. I'll also mention that I saw in a different video on YouTube, not the one that I'm going to show you, but somebody shows that there's the fruit and there's the leaves, and the guy doing the video, he shows you, he won't even touch it with his hands. He has like a special glove that he cracks open the leaf, and there's this white thing inside the leaf, and he says that white thing, he calls it a milk that's secreted from the leaf. He says if that touches your eye, it could blind you instantly. So this is known as a toxic fruit in general, and to me it just struck me again the connection to being blinded, specifically because that comes back full circle to the whole salt and the blinding, and the people of Sedom being blind, and her being blind, and the salt of Sedom blinding. So let me read to you here from Wikipedia, and then we will watch the video. Calotropis procera is a species of flowering plant in the family Apocynaceae, that is native to northern and tropical Africa, Western Asia, South Asia, and Indochina, which is mainland Southeast Asia. And all these farms seem to be saying that this fruit is native to the region of Sedom, which perhaps matches up with it being northern Africa. Anyway, its green fruit contains a toxic milky sap that is extremely bitter and turns into a latex-like substance, which is resistant to soap. Common names for the plant include apple of Sedom, etc., etc. The name apple of Sedom and Dead Sea apple stem from the ancient authors Josephus and Tacitus, who described the plant growing in the area of biblical Sedom. The fiber of the Sedom apple may have been used for the linen of the high priests. Citation needed. The fruit is described by the Roman Jewish historian Josephus, who saw it growing near what he called Sedom, near the Dead Sea, as well as the ashes growing in the fruit, which fruits have a color as if they were fit to be eaten, but if you pluck them with your hands, they dissolve into smoke and ashes. Okay, so that's the apple of Sedom, the Calotropis procera, and I'll show you the video now. And you're not going to see it dissolve into ashes, but you will see that it is a toxic fruit, and it does look like a beautiful edible fruit on the outside, but it is in fact nothing of the sort. And here's where we'll pause the recording, and I'll show you the video.